you. Okay. So now we've had time to really absorb that statement. So as I said, at the moment, there is still a significant lack of biomarkers to ground psychiatric diagnoses. And that means that there is this reliance on testimony of the patient and on diagnostic manuals to determine diagnosis. Now, I want to be clear before I get started that mental health problems are very real, and that's not up for debate here. However, the way that psychiatric diagnostic categories have been carved up is it's a largely hermeneutic endeavor, where distinct lines that have been attempted to be drawn are often in fact blurred. Now, in the recent years, the legitimacy of the DSM has come under attack, not least from members of the Mad Pride movement and other activists, and I think it's rightly so. So I want us to look again at this statement. Whilst the DSM may go some way towards creating this universal framework for understanding psychiatric illness amongst healthcare professionals and researchers, what's missing from that mission statement is the pursuit of a common language between the clinician and the patient. And by emphasizing communication about patients rather than to patients, it seems that the APA suggests that the patient's understanding of their psychiatric illness is secondary, perhaps, to that of the clinician and the researcher. So despite the central role the doctor-patient dialogue plays in psychiatry, the voice of the patient is notably omitted from diagnostic manuals to some extent. And instead, there's a privilege that's afforded to the third-person perspective, the DSM, and of the psychiatrist who mediates it. Now, as a result, the sense-making of psychiatric illness has been limited to that which can be conveyed through the language of the DSM. And that's been recognized as a form of hermeneutical injustice by some of our fantastic epistemic injustice scholars here at University of Birmingham. I won't dive into that in too much depth today because there's a lot of other things I want to talk about, but this emerges from the work of Miranda Fricker, and hermeneutical injustice occurs when certain people are excluded from contributing towards an interpretive framework, which means that there are gaps where marginalized interpretations ought to be. Now, in today's talk, I want to consider the Ontic significance of psychiatric diagnosis. And I want to examine this shift in what I'm calling Ontic power from the psychiatrist to members of the public who are increasingly self-diagnosing with the help of AI-powered chatbots and the social media space. Now, on the surface, this might seem to be like a form of hermeneutical and Ontic empowerment, but for those with mental ill health. However, I'm going to consider some of the profound problems that might arise from this shift. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to go through. We're not going to be able to visit Ontic injustice today because I practiced this on the train and it went way over half an hour and I'm going to train for an hour. So we'll start with social ontology and Ontic power. Then we're just going to go to the shift in Ontic power, what I think some of these outcomes might be, and then some concluding thoughts. So social ontology is the study of how the social world is constructed. And philosophers of social ontology scrutinize these commonplace socially constructed phenomena that we take for granted. And that might be things like money, marriage, laws, and language. And these are social facts that are the product of human institutions. And people too can be socially constructed into members of a certain social kind, like an academic or a prime minister, a wife, or a judge. Now, these social roles have socially created permissions and duties and constraints. And to be a member of a social kind, members of a society need to collectively recognize people as those kinds through, say, like a ceremony, like when you're getting married, or a swearing in, like when you're graduating. I propose that diagnosis too could be understood as a kind of social procedure whereby somebody has a social kind bestowed upon them. The diagnosis functions as, of course, it's a key part of the treatment process at the moment. However, diagnosis can also designate a social kind, I think. This is unlikely to be the case with a transitory healthcare issue. I've got an issue with my foot that shouldn't hopefully take up my entire identity anytime soon. If, however, the diagnosis is this long-lasting, has a long-lasting effect and has a profound impact on one's life, it might end up designating a social kind. So this diagnosis can do more than just identify an illness. It could perhaps encompass so much of one's life that it informs one's identity and it becomes a kind of social kind. Thus, with the power to diagnose, the psychiatrist has a kind of ontic power. By this, I mean the power to create social facts and social kinds. And this power, of course, comes from their medical expertise. And to reiterate, it's done in order to best serve the patient. Nevertheless, ontic power is this really interesting phenomenon, I think, and I think it's worth exploring in a bit more detail. So to develop this concept of ontic power, I turn to, I'm going to say friere. My Brazilian friends say I keep saying it wrong, but I'm afraid I'm just going to go with friere. Their Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a book that I've recently read and I've fallen in love with it. I think it's incredible. That he discusses this teacher-student relationship. And in this relationship, it's apparent that the teacher has the ontic power to dictate to the student the way the world is. These concepts are owned by the teacher. They misleadingly represent these social facts as being objective facts, as though reality were not, in the words of Freire, a process undergoing constant transformation. They include the malleability of social facts. And moreover, ontic power is this creative power that the teacher enjoys as they can fulfill what Freire calls their ontological vocation of meaning making, which makes them distinctly human. There's something human about that activity, about the ontological vocation. In contrast, the student is denied their ontological vocation, which prevents them from being fully human, in the words of Freire. Instead, they receive the world as passive entities. Elsewhere, Freire notes that the student without ontic power is merely in the world, not with the world or with others. The individual is a spectator and not a recreator. If there's any phenomenologists in the room, I'm sure they're getting very excited about this. I haven't got time to dive into the phenomenology of this today. I think just the main takeaway is that there's some kind of significance there with ontic power and this being in the world as a creator of the world and not as a passive object. So in contrast, then you've got the teacher with their ontic power who is with the world and with others. By analogy, I think you can imagine that the healthcare professional, the psychiatrist who owns the relevant medical hermeneutic resources is able to dictate the empirical manner in which we should understand a given illness. Particularly salient to psychiatric healthcare is the fact that although the experience of the psychiatric patient is very real, most of these diagnostic categories aren't, as we've said, rooted in biomarkers. Rather, they're diagnostic categories that may shrink or expand and change over time. And yet they are presented as objective and fixed facts. The patient receives these facts as passive entities, as they're barred from contributing to the interpretive framework. The healthcare professional, in contrast, then achieves their ontological vocation and as such can experience being with the world and with others. Okay, so ontic injustice in mental health. We're going to skip through that because there's no time. The shift in ontic power. So what I wanted to establish is that the psychiatric healthcare professional has this ontic power to inform the ways in which psychiatric conditions are understood and can designate diagnostic social kinds. However, in recent years, we're seeing a shift in this ontic power away from the healthcare professional and towards the public. In general, there's been a move towards self-administered mental health care through apps like Calm or Headspace. I think this became perhaps particularly more popular over the COVID-19 pandemic. This can involve personalized mood tracking and relaxation exercises and things like this. This self-administered mental health care is now moving into the realm of self-diagnosis. Self-diagnosis refers to the practice of individuals independently assessing and determining their own medical or mental health conditions without seeking the guidance of healthcare professionals. So I found some interesting studies that said that nearly a third have self-diagnosed a mental health condition, including depression, anxiety, and OCD. The majority of those who self-diagnosed a mental health condition were between 16 and 24 years old. As a self-diagnosis doesn't lead to administered treatment like therapy or medication or other government assistance like housing, self-diagnosis seems to be mainly for the purpose of both self-understanding and receiving understanding from others. And that might be particularly salient for young people who are especially focused on self-discovery and identity. Certain diagnostic categories have developed a strong community, particularly, let's say, that of neurodiversity, which people with this condition may find strength and solace in. Now, there are two forms of self-diagnosis that I want to explore today and that occur in digital spaces, and that's those mediated by AI-powered chatbots and that mediated by social media. But I do think that those two often do work in tandem. While using Google to self-diagnose has been popular since Google was created, through the advancement of AI-powered chatbots, this kind of self-diagnosis has taken on, I think, a different form. Opposed to a Google search, a chatbot uses natural language processing to simulate a human conversation, asking questions, offering healthcare information. Now, studies have demonstrated that this anthropomorphism has garnered greater trust from the user. And although they're not designed, or most of them aren't designed or intended to offer legitimate healthcare advice, they are increasingly being used in this way, particularly by young people. There are a number of different chatbots out there at the moment. However, ChatGPT seems to be particularly popular. There's a study by Shahsavar and Chowdhury, which found that 78.4% of people in the study, that was 476 people in the study, were willing to use ChatGPT for self-diagnosis. And then further studies have shown that using ChatGPT for self-diagnosis is more common in young people. Now, thinking about social media, on TikTok, videos with the tag #mental-health have amassed over 17 billion views, providing easily accessible content such as mental health tips and anecdotal experiences with mental illness to the public. Our studies have shown that it's common for young people to self-diagnose after watching and reading social media posts that they think relate to their own experiences. Now, while healthcare professionals are obviously among the ranks of content creators on these platforms, content relating to the lived experience of mental health conditions is mostly made by young people for their peers. People also perhaps colloquially say that they have been diagnosed by the social media algorithm, which is something I thought was really interesting. This seems to be particularly common amongst TikTok users, but it could occur on other social media platforms where the For Me section is seemingly curated by this algorithm that tracks their interests. And people say, right, that the algorithm's been following what I'm interested in, and now it's diagnosed me perhaps with autism or with ADHD, depending on what appears on their feed. Groups coalesce on social media around particular diagnoses, which leads to sharing informal medical advice and consulting with other members who have similar experiences, sometimes offering diagnoses to others based on certain behaviors shared online. So to qualify as a member of this diagnostic group, other members of the group will sometimes require the new member to prove their diagnosis according to a threshold that's been set by the group. And certain people might be accused of faking their diagnosis in these spaces. What I thought was interesting is that Corzine and Roy observed that these online diagnoses still actually borrow bits and pieces from the DSM and medical models in order to sort of bolster the credibility, despite the fact that there's also the simultaneous rejection of medical models as well, which I thought was a strange paradox there. A further interesting element to the shift in Ontic power is that members of the public have begun self-diagnosing with subtypes of conditions which don't currently exist in diagnostic manuals. One that's perhaps uncontroversial would be Asperger's syndrome. It's a subtype of autism that was previously diagnosed by medical professionals, but it's now been subsumed into the broader category of autism in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11. Nevertheless, there's this strong so-called ASPE community online that's still identified with this diagnosis, either following from a clinical diagnosis prior to the removal of the subtype, or some people are self-diagnosing after the fact, even though this Asperger's syndrome isn't in these manuals anymore. However, there's also some that were never in diagnostic manuals. You've got the growing prevalence of the diagnosis of AUD-HD in digital spaces. That's not listed in the DSM-5 or the ICD-11, and it's an acronym that's been utilized to describe the co-occurrence of ADHD and autism. This raises the question, is this comorbidity or is it a new diagnosis? I think that the answer might depend on whether AUD-HD is considered or experienced as a unique diagnostic identity, which many self-diagnosed seem to believe it is. It's something distinct from the other two diagnoses. It's a distinct identity. Another example is that of pure O, a subtype of OCD that's gained significant traction in social media spaces around the time that it was popularized in a TV show called Pure in 2019. Pure O is characterized as OCD without the compulsion and just the obsession. However, many people with OCD do perform internal compulsions by engaging in mental rituals. Like, for example, if you feel the need to list all the people that you know in your mind for fear that something bad might happen to them if you don't, that would be an internal kind of obsession and compulsion, because the compulsion is the internal listing. Therefore, the pure O subtype could perhaps just be a typical form of OCD characterized where the internal compulsion is mistakenly not recognized as being a compulsion. In recent years, pure O has become less popular on social media. It's a waning diagnostic group, and that demonstrates this transient nature of these non-clinical diagnostic categories. I think it's interesting to consider if this Ontic shift can move so far as to allow members of the public to create entirely new diagnostic categories. That's something that I think could be possible, that the public may be able to develop new social kinds, new diagnostic groups. I think there's at least 4 potential factors for this shift. Shift in trust away from experts, greater autonomy, long wait times versus instant diagnosis and discretion. I think this trend, starting with shifts in trust, I think this trend of self-diagnosis suggests that there's shifts in trust away from the psychiatrist. The literature on epistemic injustice in psychiatric care has provided countless tragic examples of service users who've lost trust in psychiatric professionals to take them seriously, to listen to them, to diagnose them accurately without being influenced by identity prejudice. In contrast, studies show that AI-powered chatbots are increasingly perceived as being reliable and trustworthy for diagnosis, particularly among young people. I suspect that there may now be greater trust in AI-powered chatbots and the social media algorithm over psychiatrists themselves amongst young people. But I haven't been able to find empirical work on this, and that's empirical work that I really want to do in the near future to determine whether that's the case. Underhill and Fuchs found that some young people on Reddit expressed that the first-person perspective of a given illness is more accurate or trustworthy than the third-person perspective of the psychiatrist. It's a quote here. A doctor can't look at you and say you are depressed. They can only ask you questions that you can already ask yourself. You've got Appler, who found some reports via TikTok that suggested that some young people felt that social media and other digital spaces were more informative and had a greater understanding than psychiatrists. One quote, "Thank you, Tumblr and Pinterest, for educating me because my psychs did nothing." Then on this idea of greater autonomy, as we've seen, psychiatric care can be but sometimes paternalistic and alienating. And psychiatric patients often report feeling this lack of control and decision-making in these spaces. In contrast, through self-diagnosis, individuals actively participate in their healthcare decisions, offering a sense of control, independence, and flexibility. And this ontic power, as I've called it, is now in their hands. Moreover, this avoids the risk of feeling the need to make public or take seriously a definitive and sometimes highly stigmatized mental health condition, which then can lead on to certain social constraints. A chatbot diagnosis, looking at the idea of accessibility, it's far quicker than one from a psychiatrist due to increasing wait times. Found that those facing the longest wait times for mental health care is now nearly 2 years. In comparison, you've got AI-powered chatbots and social media algorithms, and it's much faster process. It's almost instant. Some feel that the inability to access mental health care and obtain this verified diagnosis shouldn't preclude somebody from identifying with a diagnosis. Moreover, parents can act as gatekeepers for access to diagnosis. In addition, in locations without free healthcare, financial situations might preclude access to a formal diagnosis. And finally, you've got this idea of discretion. Via AI or social media, you haven't got these persisting stigmas that relate to mental ill health. A diagnosis from a chatbot provides the scenario where only the unwell individual is aware of the diagnosis. In addition, for young people, this might be a form of diagnosis that bypasses their parents, and this might be particularly salient in groups where there's even greater stigma from different generations or particular cultures. Okay, so what are some of the outcomes? The first question that is raised a lot in the literature is this question of accuracy. Studies have demonstrated conflicting results regarding the accuracy of self-diagnosis in digital spaces and via digital tools. There was an interesting study by Rutter et al. Who found that the self-reports of those clinically diagnosed with depression, generalized anxiety, and insomnia closely resembled those self-diagnosed via social media with those conditions, though inaccuracy was found in the self-diagnosis of mania and alcohol use disorder. Although in contrast, Outler et al. Found that less than 14% of TikTok posts in their study discussing autism met inclusion criteria for autism. And there's also this study by Kim et al., where ChatGPT's diagnosis accuracy was found to be about 66.2%. They found that ChatGPT particularly struggled with the diagnosis of developmental and learning disorders. I think something that's obviously missing here in these studies is the significance of human interaction in the diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder. The dialogue between the doctor and the patient goes beyond the assessment of words. It's more dynamic than this. The doctor's able to consider tone, gestures, can interpret intonations, and so on. But on the other hand, as somebody who's worked on the epistemic injustices that are rife in psychiatric healthcare, it could be argued that the implicit biases that are responsible for such injustices might be less likely to occur via an AI chatbot, although we know that algorithms and chatbots are certainly not bias-free. 5 minutes, okay, great. However, when concerns are raised over diagnostic accuracy, what's actually being asked is how closely it aligns with the diagnosis a trained psychiatrist would give. At first, there's, of course, not a complete harmony amongst the psychiatrists in regard to diagnosis. Although the purpose of the DSM is not to achieve this harmony, it's not impossible for one person to be they might be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder from one psychiatrist and then PTSD from another. Moreover, as we've explored, the ways in which we've carved out psychiatric disorders, while not arbitrary, is a drawing up of artificial boundaries that could have been interpreted in a different way. Perhaps our understanding of some of these conditions ought to be amended to better align with experiences of those with lived experiences. What if this shift in Ontic power to members of the public means a shift in the interpretive framework, so that we've got new ways of understanding specific mental health conditions? This would result in a new interpretive framework that is meaningful, first and foremost, to those who have the mental health condition. It seems that this shift in Ontic and interpretive power is perhaps the way to achieve a more hermeneutically just environment. However, I'm now going to challenge this by looking at some of the unhelpful things that occur due to this shift. So marginalized groups, such as those with mental health issues, have historically been denied a voice. And then on the surface, it looks like they might have found this voice in these online spaces. And that might, in theory, be able to improve self-knowledge and knowledge about mental ill health in general, and perhaps even alleviate some of the stigma associated with these. However, voices on social media are not evenly distributed. There's this interesting paper by Cizek and Haven, who explore the vocalization of trans experiences in online spaces and how a skewed or one-sided perception of these experiences is shaped by the influencers who has achieved social media fame. And that paper argues that this popularity is impacted by things like financial resources and institutional access. And I also imagine that the intersectional identity of the influencer would also have an impact. For example, a younger person may be more likely to have a lot of followers. So too, in regards to psychiatric illness, the influencers who dictate what OCD or autism is may not represent all echelons of that condition, leading to gaps in the way in which these conditions are understood. Moreover, the rarer versions of a condition may be drowned out by the voice of the majority of the more common versions of the condition. It might be the case that the high-functioning version of a condition is more likely to be bolstered by a social media platform than the rarer, lower-functioning version. This increases the othering and the silencing of those rarer or more debilitating versions of a condition. And that results in people being othered within their own diagnostic category. Moreover, those who receive a popularity on social media may be from particular social demographics. So lacunas may emerge where the intersectional voices ought to be. Therefore, greater attention needs to be paid to who is given a voice on these platforms and who gets to structure the interpretive framework. A further concern is that in digital spaces, diagnostic terminology inflates and expands without hermeneutical boundaries. In 2021, I published a paper with Javi Corral where we explored how OCD was being portrayed on social media. We found that OCD had been distorted to mainly involve being tidy and organized. A similar study took place in 2022 by Tutan et al. Here's a quote. They said, versions of the social media posts that normalized anxiety led to increased likelihood that participants would consider their own anxiety to be disordered through identification with the person featured in the post. So the viewer who particularly admired this content creator, they would be more likely to ascribe themselves the same diagnosis. And then the same thing was found with dissociative identity disorder and Tourette's. This dilution of diagnostic terminology is a harmful distortion as it robs the diagnostic term of its hermeneutical power. So if I say I have OCD to a member of the public, it now could be understood as me saying, I like things to be tidy. Just not the case. The harmful symptoms of these diagnoses that actually make them a disorder, like intrusive thoughts, time-consuming repetitive actions, are then excluded from the definition. And Corral and I actually term this wrongful depathologization. Just quickly take us to the conclusion. We've examined the causes and outcomes briefly of diagnostic power being taken out of the hands of the psychiatric professionals and put into the hands of the public through things like chatbots and social media communities. Although this shift could be considered a kind of ontic empowerment for people with mental ill health, there's a risk that reshaping diagnostic categories in digital spaces can lead to a distortion and dilution of diagnostic categories. While exciting new work is underway to find biomarkers for psychiatric conditions, the lived experience of the ill person is still essential for a complete understanding of the condition and to avoid hermeneutic and ontic injustices. I argue that the Ontic power of creating diagnostic categories needs to be shared between the clinician and the service user. An unregulated and transient interpretive framework outside of psychiatry hurts not only those with psychiatric ill health, but is particularly impactful on those with the most debilitating forms of a given condition and those with intersectional identities. I'll draw it to a close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much for the invitation. And also thank you, Lucienne, for your extraordinarily interesting talk. So really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my talk is called The Ethical Roboticist. And I'm going to start by talking about robot ethics, which is basically ethics for humans. And if we have time, in part 2, I'll talk about ethics for robots. So let me start with a very simple explanation of what an intelligent robot is. So it's basically an embodied artificial intelligence, an AI with a physical body that is capable of both sensing the world and then acting upon the world. And in this diagram, you can see we have what we call the sense act loop, and moderated, of course, by some artificial intelligence. I hope that's relatively easy to follow. So what is robot and AI ethics about? Well, it's basically concerned with the ethical impact of robots and AIs on individuals, society, and the environment, and of course, how any negative impacts can be mitigated. And in practical terms, that means that the people who should be doing robot ethics are human designers, manufacturers, operators, and maintainers. Now, people often ask me, so what does a professor of robot ethics do? Well, I mostly worry. Professional worrier, which is not great for my health, but nevertheless, there we are. But of course, worrying isn't enough. So what I do in practice is these set of 4 things. We develop ethical principles in order to support and guide the way in which robots and AI are designed and deployed. We develop methods for values-driven design, or sometimes referred to as ethically aligned design. We draft new ethical standards, and I'll mention that very briefly. And of course, advocacy is also part of the job description. So I spend a lot of time, for instance, talking everything from public engagement through to membership of select committees, lords and commons and such like, and advocating wherever I possibly can. So what kinds of harms can robots and AIs cause? Well, essentially, there are 4 broad categories. Physical harm, of course, and we shouldn't forget that, because ethics, of course, is kind of safety plus. Then psychological harms, those might include deception, over-dependency, over-trusting, for instance. Societal harms, loss of privacy, loss of jobs. And I should, of course, add harms to democracy as well, to that kind of societal question, particularly when we're talking about AIs. And incredibly important, of course, particularly in relation to AIs, environmental harms. In other words, the high energy costs of AIs, and then, of course, also unrepairable or unrecyclable technology. There's an awful lot of that. So there are plenty of harms. Do we know examples? Well, in fact, we do, because there is this fabulous, well, it's fabulous in the sense that it exists. It would be much better if it didn't have to exist, of course. But there is the AI incidents database, which is essentially a crowdsourced collection of harms that have, well, not only harms, but near misses. Near misses in the business are referred to as incidents. So the AI incidents database contains both accidents and incidents for AIs and robots. It's a really interesting resource. I suggest you look at it if you haven't seen it before. The only problem, of course, is because it's crowdsourced, then the only accidents and incidents that appear on it are those that have made it to the press. So in a sense, you can think of the AI incidents database as as it were, the tip of the iceberg. You can guarantee, I would say, that there are a larger number of unreported harms and near-miss harms. This is the aim. It's dedicated to indexing the collective history of harms or near harms by the deployment of artificial intelligence systems. And the idea is that we learn from experience. Well, I don't think we are very much, certainly not in AI as far as I'm concerned. So that's what AI, robot and AI ethics is. Let me talk a little bit about work in my work in ethical governance and standards and regulations. So I published this paper in 2018 with my long-term collaborator, Marina Jarotka, and we presented a number of maps of kind of the ethical governance framework. And essentially, this map, this is part of one of those diagrams, shows that ethics really underpin standards, and in turn, standards underpin regulation. Typically, regulation cannot exist unless there are standards against which a certifying agency, a regulator, in other words, can require compliance. So really, everything that's important about keeping us safe from robots and AIs start from ethical principles. Now, fortunately, there are plenty of those. In fact, we have more than enough ethical principles. There have been many surveys, and there are hundreds of sets of ethical principles. Sadly, there's a huge gap between ethical principles and ethical practice. This is just one. I'm going to give you a singular example. This is the European Commission's 7 requirements for trustworthy AI, published in 2019. And you can see around the outside, we have all the right words: transparency, privacy, data governance, technical robustness and safety, human agency and oversight, accountability, societal and environmental well-being, and diversity, non-discrimination and fairness. And even better, right in the middle, we have to be continuously evaluated and addressed throughout an AI system's life cycle. Well, of course, with most of the AIs, including many of those that Lucienne referred to, there is, in fact, no continuous evaluation, let alone any of these ethical requirements being at least transparently met, which is very depressing. So standards, I've become a bit of a standards evangelist since I started working in robot ethics. Standards are kind of like infrastructure. I think just as important as roads and telephones and railways and water systems and so on. I mean, did you realize, for instance, that there are 4 international standards at work when you brush your teeth? There are 2 standards for the toothbrush, one for manual toothbrushes, the other for electric toothbrushes. There's a standard for the toothpaste and a standard for the water that you use to rinse out your mouth after you've brushed your teeth. So standards are everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. It's probably one of the most remarkable bits of hidden infrastructure that essentially keeps us all safe. So you can see I've become a bit of a standards evangelist. And I've been involved in several standards myself. The first one I was involved in was with the British Standards Institute. In 2016, we published a standard called Robots and Robotic Devices, a guide to the ethical design and application of robots and robotic systems. Now, what is that? Let me translate that into kind of plain English. It's essentially a standard with a method for doing ethical risk assessment of robots and robotic devices. In fact, it works equally well for AIs, for disembodied AIs. And I'll give you an example. Myself and one of my postdocs, Katie Winkle, we published this paper in 2020 where we do a kind of ethical risk assessment for a fictional, not a functional, a fictional robot toy called Roboted. Those of you that know the Spielberg movie AI, Artificial Intelligence, will know Roboted from that movie. So, and I'm just going to give a simple, very quick look at some of the psychological risks. There are other risks, of course, physical risks, transparency risks, and so on. So one of them, for instance, is addiction. That is, the child plays obsessively with the teddy bear and neglects their family. So how might you mitigate that? Well, you might build into the robot a Roboted needs to sleep function, which means that after 10 or 20 minutes or whatever is a good idea of play, then the teddy bear simply exclaims, "I'm sorry, but I need to go to sleep now." And that seems to be a real, quite a sensible mitigation. Of course, this is all fictional, but then I think I'm going to mention the third one down because this is interesting. Another hazard is over-trusting by the parents. And of course, I've not told you this, but essentially this functional, this fictional, not functional, fictional robot teddy bear has a childminder function. Now, the risk, the hazard, is that the parents overtrust that particular function, and that is clearly a high level risk. And so mitigation is simply to remove the childminder function altogether. So I hope that gives you a very quick, if you like, superficial but I hope useful introduction to ethical risk assessment. Now, a much more recent project, again with my colleague Marina Jarotka at Oxford, looked at the possibility of accident investigation. So here's a simple scenario. Imagine that your elderly grandmother, in my case, my elderly mother, has an assisted living robot that helps her to, for instance, keep hydrated. It reminds her to drink water and to take her medicines. It also keeps an eye on her and if anything goes wrong, can raise the alarm. So that's a fictional scenario, but it's actually very plausible because robots like this exist right now. So we basically proposed in 2017 that all robots, and in fact, actually by extension, all AIs, should be equipped with what we call an ethical black box. It's basically a data logger that does the same job as a flight data recorder in an aircraft. And of course, the thinking behind this is very simple. If you do not have that kind of data log of what the robot was doing and when, then you have no ground truth to help you to actually figure out what went wrong in the accident, to cause the accident. And of course, if you can't figure out what caused the accident, you cannot fix it so it doesn't happen again. Now, robot accident investigation is a profoundly human process. And in fact, in the project, we ran a series of simulated accident scenarios with human volunteers as both the subject of the accident, witnesses to the accident, and critically important members of the accident investigation team. And I should, of course, say that all of this was done with ethics approval, and no robots or humans were harmed. So we, over the past 4 or so years, we were delayed a bit, of course, by COVID. We ran a series of 3 simulated accidents. The first one was a physical accident involving much the same kind of scenario that I've just outlined very briefly in our assisted living studio, which is inside the Bristol Robotics Lab. Our second, and I think most interesting accident investigation was a smart toy robot, not that dissimilar to the Roboted scenario, except it was a robot dog. The important thing about the second simulation is that there was no singular event that caused the accident, because the harm was psychological, which built up over some time. I won't go into detail, but if you want to ask me questions, please do, of course. And the final accident was a kind of industrially oriented accident centered around an upper body exoskeleton, in fact, designed, built by one of the spin-out companies from the lab. So
I'm just saying you've got probably 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm almost done for the first part. I really won't worry too much about the second part. But so I just wanted to share with you something new to worry about. What is it? Well, there's a whole generation of robots now that are being equipped with large language models. Now, I regard this as a very bad idea. And I mean, here's just an image from a survey paper. Actually, I made a mistake. It's not 2015, this is 2025. So this is a paper that was published just a month or 2 ago, 2025. Why do I think this is a very bad idea? Because, well, I think it's a bad idea because these AIs, these LLMs, are essentially trained on data scraped from the internet and are perfectly capable, of course, of hallucinating, which is a euphemism, of course, for telling lies or telling untruths. Now, you know, an LLM that tells lies is bad enough online, but if it's controlling machinery, then we should be very worried indeed. So that brings me to the end of part 1. Part 2, oh no, and I just wanted to mention that, of course, that AI regulation and standards, there's plenty of regulation, there are plenty of standards, and in fact, we wrote a paper in 2024 on this. I regard this as one of my most boring papers, but nevertheless, people tell me it's valuable. But that brings me to the end of this first part.
Thanks very much, Yaron. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to present here because, as Yara said, most of my academic life has been based at this university. Actually, in here, I've been a master's student receiving a lecture. I then did a lecture as a teaching assistant when I was doing my PhD in this room, and now I'm giving a talk. So it's a very nice roundabout journey. Yeah, full circle moment. So today I'm going to talk a bit about my work in mental health and in terms of AI and machine learning. I'm going to give a bit of an overview and about AI in healthcare in general before I move on into a particular example of AI in mental health in my own research. I'm going to use examples from the phenotype that I work with. So I work a lot with psychosis and depression, and I work a lot in translational stuff. So using neuroscience to translate into a clinical setting. I'm going to go through some of those concepts with you, and hopefully it will all make sense. And if it doesn't, we'll have a lot of questions for the 15 minutes of question time. So without further ado, the previous speakers have talked a lot about AI and machine learning, so they've given me quite an easy job. But I did want to mention that when we think about AI currently, in the current climate, what most people will think are large language models and chatbots. But AI is much bigger than that. It's about prediction modeling, so whether we can predict future outcomes with current data. It's also unsupervised AI, where we use certain algorithms to try and identify certain patterns in data sets that we have, whether that is biomedical data or clinical data. And my focus is going to be more on that side of AI rather than the large language models side of them, of the problem. So I'm going to talk a lot about machine learning, which in this nice little graph shows where it sits within the artificial intelligence circle. So as artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. Machine learning is the way that we can achieve AI. So those are the algorithms that we might use that give computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And you also might have heard about deep learning. I'm not going to touch upon that a lot today, but deep learning mimics the way that human neurons learn, and they create artificial neural networks to identify patterns. So why is AI needed in mental health research and care? There's some philosophy students in here. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah. Does anybody want to say? Anyone brave enough to? Plato's Cave. What does it depict? Do you want to?
The idea that what is being perceived on the cave wall, the person who's chained in the cave thinks is reality, but in fact it's just the shadows of birds going by and things like that. They think that the shadow is the real thing.
Yes, Jackson, very, very well explained. And thank you very much, Lucienne. And I would say that this is a little bit of how current diagnoses and diagnostic structures that we currently have in psychiatry are in terms of their biomedical basis. And Lucienne touched upon that we don't have biomarkers for current diagnoses. So we're looking a little bit at the shadows of, the diagnostic category of schizophrenia, but it doesn't really reflect the actual biomedical etiology of someone, of an individual. And my thesis is that AI can help us disentangle a little bit that understanding and improve our biological understanding of mental health diagnoses, even perhaps moving beyond what the DSM and the ICD have. So in general, in healthcare, the use of algorithms and mathematical equations for the improvement of care has been here for a while. One of the first examples is in the 1950s with the nomogram that was developed for the estimation of adequate ventilation during the polio epidemic in the 50s, where you have a simple regression where you take the weight of an individual, the gender of an individual, certain other variables like daily activity, fever, and then you could calculate with relative accuracy what's the accurate and best ventilation measures to give to that particular person. So it's very personalized, right? Personalized medicine. Similarly, we have cardiovascular disease risk scores with treatment guidelines in 1998, where you can take certain variables, again, like age, gender, total cholesterol, and then calculate the risk level for an individual or a risk of cardiovascular disease, whether it's high, intermediate, or low, with the relative treatment options that come with that risk categorization. In psychiatry, we have none of that, unfortunately. So it's a lot of trial and error in diagnosis, trial and error in treatment, where you might have somebody come to the clinic and you try one line of medication, they come back and they say, I've got these side effects, or maybe this hasn't treated the underlying cause, and you switch medication. You might then have treatment resistance. So why is it that while in other areas of medicine, lots of regressions and risk calculators have been developed and applied in a clinical setting, but none of those in mental health, even though we've got decades of research with regressions in psychiatry and psychology, other than some cases where you want to rule out an organic basis of a mental health disorder, you will never refer somebody who comes to the clinic for, I suppose, a brain scan, right? Because we don't have those biomarkers in mental health. And I'm going to move on to some examples, as I said, from the area of research that I work. So I'm very interested in neuroimaging primarily and other biological markers. And I'm interested in depression, psychosis, and clinical high risk for psychosis. A clinical high risk for psychosis is a stage before having a full psychotic disorder where you shows certain subthreshold symptoms, or you might have genetic risk or environmental risk for transition to psychosis. And in this field, especially in neuroimaging, there's been decades of research. But like I said, it's not a clinical biomarker. Neuroimaging is not a clinical biomarker for psychosis, even though we have, even from 2003, very well-established understanding that people with clinical high risk show a particular gray matter volume decline in their brains before they develop psychosis. And this has been replicated in fMRI tasks, where we see the activity of the brain rather than the structure of the brain, and also when the brain is at rest. So loads of research in this area, even beyond just clinical high risk for psychosis, in a lot of mental health disorders since the 1970s, when the MRI was first developed. There's been a lot of progress in that area, some of it from Matthew as well, when he was in the IOPPN doing a lot of imaging work with the researchers down there. And the research that has been done in this area has critically advanced the knowledge of the brain, but it hasn't been translated into the clinic. So as I said, a psychiatrist or a psychologist will never refer a mental health patient for a brain scan in order to estimate the risk or the likelihood of responding to a particular treatment, or one treatment versus another, other than if they want to exclude an organic basis for the disorder. So why has there been so little progress? And the next two slides are the only two slides where I'm going to talk a little bit about stats, and it's going to be very light touch. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will show perhaps how AI and machine learning can circumvent certain shortcomings that traditional statistics have. So a lot of the times, the way that we talk about mental health biomarkers is we compare two groups. We compare a healthy group and a patient group. In this case, I've borrowed this slide from a very close collaborator of mine, where it exemplifies the shortcomings of traditional statistics. This is Nikos Koutouleris. He found very nice patterns of gray matter volume decline in people with clinical high risk in the areas that are highlighted here. And then we take these findings and we say, okay, then somebody who has clinical high risk for psychosis exhibits these certain types of patterns in the brain. However, if we want to move towards biomarkers, we need to create personalized medicine as we see in other areas of medicine. So it needs to apply to the individual. So if we look at these findings and we plot them according to each individual that has taken part in this study, you can see here, this is plotted, every data point represents a patient, and anybody who's above this line is a healthy control. Everybody who's below the line is a person with clinical high risk. So even though there's a very good mean difference between those two groups, when we look at individuals, we will see that a lot of people who are actually healthy controls are wrongly classified as clinical high risk. So that has a low specificity as a biomarker. And a lot of people who have clinical high risk are wrongly classified as healthy controls. So low sensitivity as a biomarker. And if you want to move towards using biomedical information as a biomarker, you need to have a test that has high sensitivity and high specificity. So the reason why we have these low sensitivities and specificities in this area of research, and this is the last slide with stats, is exemplified by this nice paper that was published in Nature Medicine in 2013, where they have a toy example of two different brain measures and a hypothetical mental health disorder. So in this toy example, they say that the brain measures, with the blue line are the healthy controls, with the red line are the healthy controls, and with the blue line are the patients. So they have a difference, a clear difference in this hypothetical brain measure. The effect size of the difference, the Cohen's d, is 2. The prevalence of this disorder is 25%. Now, how does this translate to the individual level? It translates to a positive predictive value or sensitivity of 0.64 and a negative predictive value of 0.93. In order to have a biomarker in a clinical setting, you usually want to achieve a positive predictive value of over 0.8. So in this case, this diagnostic, this biomarker is failing to translate into a clinical setting. And this is with a Cohen's d of 2, an effect size of 2, which is considered a huge effect size according to literature. However, if we look at the average effect sizes that separate clinical high-risk subjects from healthy controls based on meta-analyses, effect sizes that we achieve are around 0.7 to 1.4 at maximum. And this is the same across all mental health disorders. The effect sizes that you will achieve are not so high because we have this these diagnoses that are not based on underlying biology. There we go. In order to achieve, in this example, a positive predictive value of 0.8, you would need to achieve an effect size of 3, which is unheard of in psychiatry, in psychiatric imaging. And the problem becomes even worse if the prevalence gets decreased. So for a disorder with a prevalence of 1%, and with schizophrenia, we have a prevalence of around 1 to 3%. If you want to achieve a positive predictive value of 0.8, which is the goal if you want to translate a biomarker into the clinic, you'll need to achieve roughly an effect size of 6. So then that shows how problematic it is to try and translate these findings into a clinical setting. So my thesis, as I said, is that AI and machine learning can help us overcome these drawbacks that classical group level research strategies have, and move away from statements like saying, schizophrenia recovery is associated with X, Y, Z, and move towards saying that, based on a certain algorithm, we are 80% sure that your family member will recover or will respond to a particular treatment or will have a certain type of side effects according to this algorithm. And artificial intelligence has been the next big thing for a long time, since the 1950s. There's a reason why we believe that this time it actually is going to materialize the promises that it makes. So a very quick overview of the history of AI, which started in the 1950s, where we had the first conceptualization of algorithms, very well good developed architectures, but we didn't have the data or the computational power to bring these to reality, which is where we have the first AI winter. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, computational power picks up. We have some new developments like deep learning. We have the first time where an AI system is better than a human, with beating Garry Kasparov in chess. However, again, we don't have the computational power and the immense data sets that are needed. And now, in the early 2020s, late 2010s, I think we're at the point where we're kind of like in the Goldilocks era, where we have a lot of data. Everything that we do collects data. We have the computational power to achieve these things, and this is why we're seeing this explosive growth of LLMs and prediction models all around us. So I do truly believe that we are in an era where we are going to see, at least in mental health, it has started happening in other areas of medicine, the translation of research findings into the clinic in terms of at least biomedical data. And I'll give you an example of how I've used AI in my area of research to try and improve understanding and aid clinical decision-making for clinicians. So as I said, I'm very interested in depression and psychosis. I'm very interested in the overlap between the disorders. There is a lot of heterogeneity within those two disorders, especially in the early stages of disease. It might be very easy to distinguish between somebody who has chronic schizophrenia and chronic depression, but somebody who shows within the first months of presentation, it's really difficult to distinguish. As Lucienne mentioned earlier, the current diagnoses that we have are built on experiential terms and symptom groupings rather than underlying biology, even though the majority of the tools that we have to treat these disorders are biomedical. What that means is that I might have a diagnosis of depression and you might have a diagnosis of depression, but our neurobiological pathways for arriving to that diagnosis are completely different. Yet we will receive the same treatment, we will have the same medication given to us, and vice versa. I might have a diagnosis of psychosis and you might have a diagnosis of depression, but we have similar neurobiological pathways, but we will be treated with different tools. So in terms of my interests, in terms of the gray matter volume and inflammatory markers, depression and psychosis are both disorders which show, especially in the early stages, very similar patterns in terms of the gray matter volume and cytokine levels in the blood. So I wanted to use AI and machine learning and semi-supervised machine learning to try and identify, without telling the algorithm that these people have psychosis and these people have depression, whether there will be clusters of similarity across different diagnoses. I did that using brain scans, so just gray matter volume maps of people with psychosis and depression. And I wanted to see if the algorithm would put everyone who has psychosis in one group and everyone who has depression in another group, or will the groups be transdiagnostic? Will they identify a grouping that our current diagnostic framework is not addressing? So to do that, I used what's called the semi-supervised machine learning model. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but the reason why it's called semi-supervised machine learning is because apart from the people with psychiatric diagnoses, it also uses healthy controls. So here the patients are represented by the red squares and the healthy controls are represented by the blue squares. And essentially, it identifies different clustering solutions. So it looks at 2 clustering solutions, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in iteration. And it ensures that the clusters are different between each other, but also each cluster is different from healthy controls, just to ensure that the heterogeneity that is being captured is disease-related rather than appearing in health as well. So the findings that we had were that there were 2 clusters and they were transdiagnostic. So there was no statistical significant effect of diagnosis or age or sex. So these were 2 completely new categories based purely on the biology of the people that we had the data on. And then when we looked at the differences of their gray matter volume, we saw that we had we termed one cluster as the impaired cluster because they had a lot of gray matter volume deficits. They had elevated markers in their blood. They also had a specific type of symptomatology. So they had a lot of negative symptoms. So that's like anhedonia, the loss of pleasure and loss of interest in everyday activities. And they had poor quality of life. But these were transdiagnostic clusters. So they were people both with depression and psychosis, because negative symptoms are usually associated more with psychosis rather than depression. And also the picture that I'm showing here is the gray matter volume deficits that these people have, which are widespread, and they're usually associated in meta-analyses with the picture you would observe in schizophrenia. But these are people within the first 3 months of presentation, and they also include people with depression. And also, because we used this algorithm to kind of disentangle the heterogeneity of these disorders, when we looked at the effect size that we could achieve, I don't know if it's visible here, we went all the way up to 9. And if you remember previously, the majority of effect sizes in this area, if you hit a 2, it's like really good. So this shows us that we could ideally translate this into a clinical setting. And then what we tried to do was predict symptomatological remission. So we had data from people when they first presented in the clinic, and then 9 months later. So we knew how these people did after 9 months in terms of the symptoms. So we wanted to use their baseline data to create an AI algorithm that predicts their 9-month outcomes. So the algorithm didn't know how they, it only knew how they did at 9 months, and it used their data at baseline to try and predict that. And we wanted to do it in the traditional diagnostic separation of psychosis and depression. And then we also tested it in our new neurobiological distinction of our impaired and preserved phenotypes. And this is a busy slide, but what we saw was that we could achieve a balanced accuracy, which is how accurate the model is at predicting symptomatological outcomes, with a balanced accuracy of 71% compared to a 52% and 56% in the traditional diagnostic categories. And this was a statistically significant effect. So we showed that with our new categories, we could better predict who will have increased symptoms and who will have decreased symptoms within the next 9 months. So we showed clinical utility that is based on these biomedical data that have been processed by artificial intelligence techniques. I believe that was the most interesting part of this study that we did, because we showed that we could actually translate this in a clinical setting, and actually if this was implemented in a clinical setting, we would be able to capture more patients than what we would usually normally psychiatrists and psychologists would be able to do with the tools that they have at their disposal. So I hope this has convinced you a little bit about the promise of AI. I also touched upon the challenges that we have, especially in the mental health space, about translating things into a clinical setting, and a little bit about the future directions of how I think this field should move, is talking about well-characterized multi-site data. So I know that our previous speaker talked a lot about how AI algorithms can sometimes be biased, and we need to address those potential biases at the conception of studies, where we need to have draw data from multiple populations of different ethnicities, different genders, different cultural upbringings and backgrounds, so that we ensure that the algorithms that we develop are not very particular for a very particular population, right? They generalize. Robust and novel machine learning, that goes without saying. I've talked a lot about neurobiological data, but I've put a plus here because this is my angle of research, but of course there's so many different aspects for mental health diagnoses. So we need to incorporate all those different levels of readouts, of data readouts, from the environmental all the way to the neurobiological fields. The next point I have is ambitious research questions. So I think it's necessary to challenge current dogma with the research questions that we want to address. So try and see if we can do better than the status quo with AI. And finally, collaboration. We need philosophers, ethicists, biomedical engineers, psychologists, psychiatrists, regulatory authorities to work together in order to navigate this new world, because it's going to happen with or without us, and we need to be part of this conversation if we want to ensure proper deployment of these tools. And with that, I finished at 29 minutes, so I think that's good. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to my